Good afternoon. As we wait for people to connect today, I want to thank you so much for joining us for an important and a timely discussion about the PBS series, The U.S. and the Holocaust. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Communications Director for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our entire staff, our President, Mark Melman, our board, and our board co-chairs, Todd Richmond and Ann Lewis, welcome. We hope you and yours are well. In just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to our board member, Sam Lauder, to kick off the discussion and introduce our distinguished guests. But first, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. If you like what you're hearing today, please consider checking us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can sign up for news and more information about events like today on our website, dmfi.org. And if you want to ask a question today, please submit it if you're watching on Zoom through the Q&A feature. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can submit it in the comments section, and we'll try to get to many of your questions. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to our board member, Sam Lauder. In January, President Biden appointed Sam to be a member of the Board of Trustees at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council. Sam?
Thank you, Rachel. And thank all of you for joining us today. The U.S. and the Holocaust is a three-part series that examines America's response to one of the greatest humanitarian crimes of the 20th century. This week, my wife and I finally found the time together to be able to watch it, and it's brilliant. It's an incredible piece of work. Through firsthand testimony of witnesses and survivors who as children endured persecution, violence, and flight as their families tried to escape Hitler, this series delves deeply into the tragic human consequences of public indifference, bureaucratic red tape, and restrictive quota laws in America. We want to begin our discussion by playing an excerpt from the introduction of the series, which examines America's sentiment towards Jewish immigrants seeking refuge in the 1930s and underscores how America failed to live up to its ideals.
All of my grandparents are immigrants from Eastern Europe, except one grandmother was born here. So I sort of grew up haunted by stories of, as they used to say, the old country, haunted by this story of my grandfather's brother and his family living in a provincial town in eastern Poland. And then they disappeared. All you think about is that they had been consumed by this conflagration that consumed all of Europe.
When Nazi rule began in 1933, there were 9 million Jews in Europe. 12 years later, when the Second World War ended in 1945, at least 2 out of every 3 of them had been murdered.
It's not so easy to put the picture together. The real scale of what happened to people, it is unbelievable. It boggles the imagination. You don't know what 6 million people looks like.
As the catastrophe of what would come to be called the Holocaust unfolded, Americans heard about Nazi persecutions of Jews and others on the radio, read about it in their newspapers and magazines, and glimpsed it in newsreels. Some Americans responded by denouncing the Nazis, marching in protest, and boycotting German goods. Individual Americans performed heroic acts to save individual Jews. Some government officials battled red tape and bigotry to bring Jewish refugees to America. In the end, the United States admitted some 225,000 refugees from Nazi terror, more than any other sovereign nation took in. And by defeating Nazi Germany on the battlefield, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and their allies stopped the killing of the surviving Jewish people in Europe. But during the years when escape was still possible, the American people and their government proved unwilling to welcome more than a fraction of the hundreds of thousands of desperate people seeking refuge.
The Holocaust disrupts any idea that we have of good and evil, of right and wrong. This is a story in which everyone is challenged all the time. We are challenged as Americans, we're challenged as parents, as children, we're challenged as neighbors and as friends to think about what we would have done, what we could have done, what we should have done. And even though the Holocaust physically took place in Europe, it is a story that Americans have to reckon with too.
We tell ourselves stories as a nation. One of the stories we tell ourselves is that we're a land of immigrants. But in moments of crisis, it becomes very hard for us to live up to those stories. I think the impetus should not then be to wag your finger at people in the past and think that we're somehow superior to them, but to struggle to understand why that's such a tension between having a humanitarian ideal and then living up to it on the ground.
Part of our national mythology is that we are a good people, we are a democracy. And we are a democracy, and in our better moments, we are very good people. But that's not all there is to the story. And I think if we're going to congratulate ourselves on our democracy, which I think we should, we also need to face up to the other side.
In the past few years, I've begun to wonder how serious America's commitment to looking at some of the dark marks in its history really is. How can we learn from the past? Where did we go wrong? How can we not go wrong the next time? And I think while there is much we can be proud of this country, the episode of America and the Holocaust is not one that redounds to our credit.
How did America treat its potential refugees? The refugees, they lost their lives because those doors, the golden door was not wide open.
Wow. Now I am extremely honored to have the opportunity to introduce our two distinguished speakers today to discuss the series. Sarah Botstein is the series co-director and producer. She's produced some of PBS's most popular and acclaimed documentaries for more than 2 decades. In addition to her collaboration with Ken Burns and Lynn Novick on the US and the Holocaust, she's worked together with them on the documentaries Hemingway in 2020, College Behind Bars in 2019, the Vietnam War in 2017, Prohibition in 2011, the War in 2007, and Jazz in 2001. Sarah is currently working on a 6-part series on the American Revolution and a project on President Lyndon B. Johnson's life and presidency. I'm looking forward to seeing those. Dr. Daniel Greene is an interviewee and advisor to the series. He's president and librarian at the Newberry Library in Chicago and an adjunct professor of history at Northwestern. In 2018, he curated Americans and the Holocaust, an exhibition that opened at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Greene also serves on the nominating committee of the American Historical Association and the Academic Council of the American Jewish Historical Society. We are so very grateful to have such distinguished guests here today. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Botstein and Dr. Daniel Greene.
Lovely.
I'm going to ask the first question.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, my pleasure. Daniel, this one's for you. Can you talk to us more about the political, social, and economic environment in 1930s America that led to most Americans turning their backs to what was happening in Germany as the Nazis rose to power?
Sure. Yeah. The small question, right? Thanks, Sam. I think this is one of the key points that we were trying to make in the exhibition, and it gets picked up in the film, is that one of the ways we understand how Americans respond to crises abroad, and especially to atrocities abroad, is that we have to look closely at what's happening at home. That to say domestic politics shapes our response to international crises. And in the 1930s, you have what I come to think of as almost a perfect storm, right? You have the Great Depression in the United States that begins in 1929. It's not a linear recovery. We have another, pretty major recession in 1937 and 38. You have restrictive immigration quotas that are on the books in the United States in 1924 and in a series of laws before 1924, but fully a decade before the Nazis come to power. You have xenophobia and anti-Semitism. The 1920s and the 1930s are arguably the height of anti-Semitism in the United States during the 20th century. And then as Americans start to see Europe go to war in 1939, you get ginned up fears about spies and concerns about national security. So, economics, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, fears about national security, a desire to stay out of another world war and not make the same, quote, mistake we made in World War I. All of these things are swirling around the United States, and they all shape our response to Nazism.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, Sam. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, clearly the Holocaust has been widely covered. Why this topic and why now?
Thank you for asking that question. And thank you, as Danny said, for having us. I think when we first learned that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington was mounting an exhibition on the topic Americans and the Holocaust, Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, Jeff Ward, and I all we're very, very interested in thinking about how to make a film on the same topic. Because we were all interested in this period in American history, interested in the dynamics of how we understand ourselves as Americans during the 1930s and 40s. We had made a film on the Second World War, as Sam had said, in 2007. Ken and Jeff did an extensive series on the Roosevelts that came out in 2014. And there have been so many books, so many oral history projects, so many films made about the Holocaust. And I think we teach and we think about and we understand these big, large, epic topics of the 1930s and 40s, sometimes in very isolated ways. So we understand the military narrative, the American experience in the Second World War in Europe and the Pacific. We understand about the Holocaust. What do we understand about the Holocaust? But how do we interweave the military narrative, the humanitarian crisis, and the domestic crisis all together? And we're really interested in understanding our past to help us create a better future. So in 2015, when we learned about the Holocaust exhibition, we thought, oh, we should absolutely make this film. And it was not on our schedule. And we moved things around and talked to PBS and initially thought we were going to make a 2-hour film, and we ended up with a 6-hour film on TV even earlier than we had initially expected because of the urgency we felt as we were making the film and things were happening around the world. The world is very different than it was in 2015.
Sarah, can you talked a little bit about how the exhibit at the Holocaust Museum was in some part an inspiration for the series, but can you talk to us a little bit more about how you curated the materials for the series from finding the right interviewees? Clearly, you talked to some survivors, to finding those very compelling pictures and video.
Well, first of all, I'll just finish answering the first question to segue into the second, which is to make a film about the Holocaust through the lens of the American experience was new to us, is a new way to think about it, a new way to understand ourselves as Americans, a new way to understand history. And, we did not perpetrate the Holocaust. We are the great saviors for democracy and against fascism in the Second World War. But that is not all there is to the story, as we say in the introduction. And in order to tell that story, we do what we always do, whatever the topic is: Vietnam, Prohibition, Ernest Hemingway. We find the scholars, the writers, the thinkers, the historians who have spent their lives trying to understand these big, complicated topics, and we get to know them, and we get to know them behind the camera, and sometimes we get to interview them like Danny. And then we also find, if we're working on a subject where there's anyone who has a first person story to tell, we're always interested in bearing witness and learning about history through the personal stories of extraordinary people. Everybody in the world has a story to tell, and some of those stories can highlight the human experience in ways that we can all relate to, and sometimes they can teach us things that we don't understand. And so for this topic, because we were making the film, when we were making it, the witnesses we found were children during this time. And that is a very interesting way to conduct an interview with somebody who's in their 80s, 90, Guy Stern is now 100, and then ask them to think back to their experiences as children. And some of these experiences were the defining experiences of their childhood, and in some cases, their lives, separated from their families, separated from their siblings, losing many, many members of their family, surviving themselves, making new lives, and how they understand what happened to them then, and to make meaning for our audiences is one of the great privileges of the work that I get to do. And I think the hope we have for audiences is that by interweaving the scholarship and brilliance of people like Danny, Deborah Lipstadt, Rebecca Erbelding, Daniel Mendelsohn, with the testimony of the first person stories, that the audience walks away both caring about the people that you've met and all the people in all the photographs and the newsreels who you realize have similar and different stories, and also understand it in terms of our current situation and our history.
Daniel, I wasn't sure if there's anything you wanted to add there.
I think Sarah also just spoke to the urgency and the privilege of the moment that we live in. I mean, in terms of knowing survivors, knowing veterans of the war, I think a lot about how over the past 25 years I've had the opportunity to get to know many survivors quite well, and how for my children's generation that's going to be a very different experience. But I think what Ken and Lynn and Sarah have done in this film with, telling the stories of Susan and Joe Hilsenrath, and Saul Messenger and Guy Stern, I have a hunch that that's what people will come away remembering from the film. And I think that's a great service to be able to have those stories live on.
Great. I'm going to ask a question from Harriet. Sarah, I'll go to you first on this. How can we encourage and ensure that students and young adults have access to learn from your series? For younger generations, World War II may seem like ancient history. Daniel, you just alluded to that. What does success look like from your standpoint?
Well, one of the reasons that Ken has worked at public television for 40 years, and why Lynn and Jeff and I have all dedicated the majority of our careers to working in a landscape of public media, is not only that we believe in public media and PBS is accessible to everybody everywhere in the country, but in addition to the actual film itself and the national broadcast, we spend a lot of time creating lesson plans and educational materials that are related to any film we work on. And for this film in particular, we spent the last part of the year of production working with people at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Echoes and Reflections, Facing Histories, and ourselves, different educational organizations around the country, because Holocaust history is federally and state mandated, to find ways that we could use the film in the classroom, not just in history classrooms when they teach the Second World War and the Holocaust, not always together, but also in English language arts classes where they're reading memoirs, testimonies, and oral histories, and try to use the power and the medium of documentary film in the classroom. So we have ambitious goals. It's very early to know how we're doing, because the film just came out, and it takes at least a year or two to see how the film performs in the classroom and how teachers use it. But it's one of the reasons we work at PBS, and we really do care very deeply about the educational component to the work we do.
Great. Daniel, did you want to get us to another?
Sure. Yeah. So we're going to show a clip now that takes us to 1938. And I think that 1938 is just a really important critical turning point for thinking about how Americans understand the threat of Nazism. And we're actually, and you even have to be, I think one of the things that this film is so great at, and that Ken and Sarah and Lynn and Jeff Ward are so great at, are being almost relentlessly chronological, right? So when we say what did we know as Americans, we need to say, and when. So here we're going to go to the spring of 1938. The Nazis have gone into Austria in the spring in an event known as the Anschluss. They've annexed Austria, made it part of Germany, but we're before events that will come in, say, November 1938, the November pogrom known as Kristallnacht. And in that period, in the spring of 1938, President Roosevelt calls an international conference on refugees, and over 30 nations are going to come to this international conference in Evian, France. And you know, if we live history forward rather than living history in hindsight, you can look at a moment like this and say, well, maybe the president was trying to do something, trying to raise awareness in some way, right? Calling an international conference is no small thing. And then at the same time, we realized that he was actually trying to pass this refugee problem off onto any other nation that he possibly could. And as you'll see in this clip, all the nations at Evian stand up and say, yeah, we have a terrible refugee problem, but we're not prepared to act on it at all. And it speaks to, I think, one of the most critical gaps in this history, which is the gap between disapproval, which is easy, and action, which is very difficult. In 1938, Americans are asked whether they think the persecution of Jews in Germany has been Jews' own fault. And 2/3 of Americans say partly or entirely. Something bad is happening to the Jews abroad, and an inclination of a lot of Americans is to blame the Jews.
Roosevelt called for a conference in Evian, France, for the international community to discuss a collective solution to the problem of political refugees seeking to flee Hitler. He was careful not to say that most of those in flight were Jews.
There is a sense in the US government that anti-Semitism is so strong in America that they don't want people to think that, or even get the hint that the United States might be going to do anything particular for the Jews, to rescue the Jews.
Since the U.S. Congress was not willing to alter America's quota system, Roosevelt would not ask any other country to change its own laws to take in more immigrants, though it was his hope that other countries might volunteer to do so at the upcoming conference. In July, representatives of 32 countries met for a week and managed only to form an intergovernmental committee for refugees, without any funds or power to assist them.
Representatives of all 32 nations at that conference stand up and say, this is a horrible problem. Let us tell you why we can't let in refugees now.
The French delegate claimed France had reached the extreme point of saturation as regards refugees. 4 Central American countries jointly said they had no need for merchants and intellectuals, by which they meant Jews. The Australian spokesman said, as we have no real racial problem, we are not desirous of importing one. Great Britain refused to increase and then sharply limited the number of Jews allowed into Palestine, the Middle Eastern territory they controlled. Representatives of Jewish organizations were present, but only as observers. A young Golda Meir remembered her sorrow, rage, frustration, and horror at not being allowed to speak.
So what you have is a week's worth of nations standing up, one after the other, saying, this is terrible, but we don't want any. This is awful, but we don't want any. At which point the Germans say, well, you don't want the Jews any more than we do.
Chaim Weizmann, the president of the World Zionist Organization, dedicated to creating a Jewish state in Palestine, said the globe was now divided into places where Jews cannot live and places into which they cannot enter.
really chilling stuff. I know I hadn't known about some of that history myself. Daniel, can you talk to us a little bit more about some of the restrictions the British government put on Jewish immigration to what was then the Palestinian territories?
Sure, right. So as I'm sure everyone knows here, the Palestine was under a British mandate at that time. There had been violence in riots in Palestine during the 1930s and 1936, especially. The British by 1939 then put in what's called a white paper, known as the British White Paper, where they declare they're going to let in only and not more than 75,000 immigrants over a 5-year period, right? And so that 5-year period becomes the period of the most mass murder of Jews in Europe. Of course, that's not known when the white paper is passed, but there's certainly you see restrictions all over the world. You see restrictions in the United States, you see restrictions in Palestine, and the United States and Palestine are the two countries that take more refugees than any other during this time. But as this Evian conference shows, the doors were closed. The doors were closed in most nations, and specifically the doors were closed to Jews.
Sarah, I think from what I've read, you learned a bit about your family's history in the course of producing and creating the series. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, on my father's side, my father came here as a little boy in 1949, thanks to the work of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, known as HIAS. My grandmother's first visa application was in 1935, and it took them a long time to get all the things organized and the sponsors and the paperwork to get here. So I knew my grandparents and my great-grandparents who were able to get to Mexico City, but I didn't really know the specifics of certain wings of the family and cousins and great uncles and aunts, and was surprised to find out, one, how many relatives I had who were killed, but also the interesting ways in which those who did survive got out, and other choices that my relatives made. And the story that Danny has heard me talk a lot about recently is there are actually 3 photographs of my family in the film, because when we were making the film, we said to all of the people working on the film, we're going to archives around the world. If you have family photographs of people living in these places and you want to have them in the film, we should use them. They're documentary evidence, the same, it's one family or another family. And so we were able to use a few photographs of my grandmother, my great-grandparents, my great aunts and uncles. And in one photograph, my grandmother is a little girl. She had 2 brothers. One brother was hidden by a Polish Catholic family, the girl of whom my great uncle later married, and she has a tree at Yad Vashem as a righteous Gentile. And the other brother actually went back to Poland and went into the ghetto and was part of an organizer of the Warsaw Ghetto and wanted to stand up, and died because of it, but with great agency and I think heroism, actually. And my great-grandfather's sister, when her children were taken to Draplinga from the ghetto, killed herself. She did not want the Germans or the Poles, whoever it was at that time, to take her life. So I think it's an interesting thing for Jewish Americans or Jews anywhere around the world to think about the specificity of what happened to their relatives and how they died and what happened to them and how they want to be remembered. And so we've had the experience in sharing the film with many, many, many Jews, including Lynn Novick, one of the directors, who's a Jewish woman from New York, and she didn't think she had a lot of Holocaust history, and she began to do research and learn the places where her family had come from, because they had been here for 2 generations, that she also had whole strains of her family who were wiped out in what is now Ukraine. So I think it's, Deborah Lipstadt makes the point at the end of the film, 6 million is a kind of incomprehensible number. 2 out of 3 of the European Jews did not make it. And in many ways, the Germans accomplished a goal, which is that they reduced the population of Jewry still today. And so I think finding your connections to this history is something we're definitely experienced audiences have been having that desire to find out more. And we're glad for that.
Thank you for sharing those really personal details about your family's history. That's really very moving. Sarah, what was it like to work with Ken and Lynn? I know you've collaborated on a number of projects. Could you give us some insights into that?
Oh, well, I mean, I wish everyone could be a fly on the wall in our editing room. I've worked for Ken and Lynn for more than 25 years. They're both dear friends of mine and great mentors, and we have a lot of fun. We're a tiny group at our core. We're, anywhere between 4 and 8, and at our biggest, we're about 40 when we're at the height of post-production. But in addition to working with Ken and Lynn, we have extraordinary editors, and I think we don't talk about them as much as we should. In addition to our other producers and researchers, our editors get handed literally thousands of hours of material, thousands of photographs, tons of moving images, live cinematography, endless reels of interviews. And obviously we have a script, and how they artistically put together this evidence in a way that is hopefully compelling and visually beautiful and moving, and what music we play, and all of those choices, we spend a lot of time working very closely together to figure out how to tell story visually and orally.
Wow.
They're both, I work with great people, and they're dear friends, and we all really love what we do. It's a really fun place to go to work.
That's so nice. I also feel fortunate to have wonderful colleagues, and it makes it fun to be at work.
Yes.
Very much. Daniel, I'd like to ask you a question from Eric, who submitted this. Can you talk a little bit about the anti-Jewish hatred that was prevalent and accepted on radio, even by American so-called heroes like Lindenberg and Ford, as well as Father Coughlin?
Yeah. And the series does a great job with this. If you haven't watched the film, Father Coughlin, Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford are all there. They're trading on lies about Jews, which we know 100 years ago and we know today have captive audiences, right? When people tell lies about Jews. I think the world for Americans in the 19-teens, 1920s, especially in the aftermath of World War I, is becoming a more complex, difficult place to understand. And I think there's always something alluring to people to look for simple explanations for a very complex world. And the endurance of the idea that it's the Jews or it's the Jews' fault, we see really never goes away, even after the Holocaust, right? You would think that the Holocaust would give anti-Semitism a bad name, and it does for a very short period of time. So Henry Ford, for example, is basically remixing the protocols of the Elders of Zion in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which is a widely circulating newspaper out of Michigan at the time. Father Coughlin is using new media, the radio, very effectively to reach mass audiences and to market himself, right? He's the product, his ideas, his hatred of Jews is the product too, right? And that becomes a very alluring product to many Americans. And then Lindbergh, as an isolationist working with the America First Committee in 1940 and 1941, walks a finer line. It's still very anti-Semitic rhetoric, but he'll say things like, of course I understand why Jews would want us to get involved in this war, right? So he's not denying that there are atrocities going on over there. He's just saying it's not our problem. And then he takes it even further, especially in this speech he gives in Des Moines, Iowa in September of 1941, where he threatens Jews. And he says, if we do go to war, then we'll see a greater backlash of anti-Semitism here in the United States. And it's a period of heightened anti-Semitism in the United States. And I think many Jewish leaders and some Jews themselves are deeply worried about a backlash of anti-Semitism in the United States if this is perceived as a Jewish war. So, or a war for the Jews, I should say. But you've got, those are all celebrities you mentioned, Ford, Coughlin, Lindbergh, and they use their pulpit as a celebrity to spread hatred of Jews.
And unfortunately, we see some echoes of that today. And I know you're both aware that yesterday was the 4th anniversary of the Tree of Life shooting massacre in Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania. Sarah, could you talk a little bit more about maybe some of the echoes of the past that we do see today, and to the extent that you think there's a remedy or something to be done, what could that be?
Well, I think I feel more comfortable talking about how we are all experiencing, I think, in real time, some of the echoes of, as Danny was just saying, powerful people with big platforms using their megaphones in ways that when I was little, I think were much less acceptable. And we're seeing a rise from where I sit of an acceptance of a way of speaking of just second anti-Semitism for a second, a kind of acceptance of an anti-Semitic sensibility, rhetoric, language, imagery, sentiment that is quite frightening. And we're seeing that here and in Europe. So I think it is important to understand the stakes of what those messages can mean and the horrors that can happen when hate speech and things of that nature are acceptable. We have to push against them, I think.
Sure. Daniel, anything you'd like to add on that?
Well, I think education is certainly part of it, right? And so hopefully this film, I know it has already reached millions of people, and hopefully the educational materials will continue to reach millions of people as well. I agree with Sarah. We absolutely have to stand up and call out this anti-Semitism. Holocaust education is not the only way to call out anti-Semitism, but I do think it's certainly one important way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I know there's another clip that we would like to show, and Sarah, would you like to set that up for us?
Sure. Well, in talking about the film leading up to its broadcast, but particularly since it's aired, we're getting a lot of interest and a lot of questions about why we chose to open the whole 6-hour series with the story of Anne Frank's family. And when you are turning on a film about the United States response to the Holocaust, we often get the question, why Anne Frank? And when we started working on the project, it came to our attention that Otto Frank's papers had come to light. And in fact, he had tried to come to America. And I think when I was taught Anne Frank, and most people are taught the Anne Frank story, they're not taught it in concert with American immigration, refugee policy, or lack thereof, how hard it was to get here, how families, particularly from Germany and Austria, as they were experiencing the rise of Hitler and seeing what was potentially happening, were the first wave of Jews trying to get to America. And I think people are surprised to learn that Otto Frank is on the record of trying to get here. And once we made the decision to try to include the Anne Frank story, we then thought, okay, how do we understand her diary? How do we understand this extremely important work that is one of the great documents of war? And I think human history, it's translated in almost every language. It's one of the most read books in the world. And yet the book is finished before Anne Frank is deported and before she dies and before she sees up close for herself what is happening to the Jews as they're murdered. And so we wanted to also then, for our audiences, put the book into a slightly different historic context and conversation. And we were privileged to meet an extraordinary woman who now lives in London, named Eva Schloss, who posthumously becomes Anne Frank's stepsister. And she and her mother survive one of the more harrowing experiences of Auschwitz. And she very generously and bravely shares that testimony with our audiences. So you're able to imagine so many different things, and I think hopefully understand Anne Frank in so many different ways. And we've really enjoyed conversations about that, and I think we'll continue those in the classrooms both here and abroad. So here's one of our last Anne Frank scenes from the whole film in the third episode after the war has ended.
On July 18th, 1945, Otto Frank finally discovered what had happened to his daughters. Both had still been alive when he, Eva, and Fritzi Geiringer were liberated from Auschwitz. But typhus had swept Bergen-Belsen, the camp in northern Germany where they'd been sent. Both Margot and Anne are thought to have died in February, 2 months before the camp was liberated.
Otto came to us one day. He looked like a ghost, and after he left, my mother and said, well, we have at least each other, but this poor man has nobody. He was 56 or 57 at that time. You know, what has he got to live for?
One of the Dutch Gentiles who had hidden the Franks had kept Anne's diary, planning to give it back to her when she returned. Instead, she gave it to Anne's grieving father. He could not bear to read more than a few pages at a time.
It took him 3 weeks to read it. He was so moved by it. And he always used to say, I didn't really know my own child. He was amazed about what she wrote in it. He was so proud of it. And when he got it, he had no idea about publishing it. But the history professor said that it's such a valuable document about this period, you have to publish it.
It gets tremendous attention in this country. It's presented on Broadway and then presented in a major Hollywood picture as a triumph. No one dies in the story. No one is murdered. No gas chambers, no shootings, no Nazis till the last scene when they come in. It's the story of triumph of a little girl. It's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful diary. She writes some terrific things in it. But it's not the story of the Holocaust. It's not the story of the Shoah. It's not the story of a genocide.
I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are really good at heart.
But she said that she still believes in the goodness of mankind. I said, how can she? But she wrote it before. If she would have written that after, if she would have survived, she would not have said that, I think. I still think that she wouldn't have said that.
Eva Geiringer's mother, Fritzi, would eventually marry Otto Frank. By the tragedy in both our lives, she remembered, together we found new happiness.
Very, very powerful. I wanted to just read a comment from Barry, who says, what we don't know is how many people completely gave up Judaism, who chose to erase their Jewish heritage once they immigrated to other countries. We lost them too, as far as the numbers of Jews in the world. They weren't murdered, but their heritage was destroyed or erased.
I think we're seeing some of those people are finding some of their Jewish heritage and reclaiming it. So it's interesting how that ebbs and flows over time.
Yeah, it's not something that I feel I have any expertise on, and it's not something that's covered in this history, but there is great work on questions about belief and theology after the Holocaust. And you see a lot of that actually in survivors' memoirs too, right? Reflecting on questions like, how can we believe in a God after the Holocaust, right? That's far outside the realm of the exhibition and Americans' response, but it's another fascinating angle to study. I think it's so, in thinking about that too, I think it's so important what Eva Geiringer says to close that clip, because I think for too long an American story about the Holocaust has often been a happy story about the Holocaust, and I think that's kind of what Deborah Lipstadt is getting at. The play, The Diary of Anne Frank, while an important cultural moment, is a redemptive play with very little Jewish content to it. It's a very Christian take on the Holocaust to have such a redemptive story. And what Eva says there at the end, I think, is so important, because still I have students who will walk into class, undergraduates who will walk into class, and what they've heard about the Holocaust is, oh, well, this is humans in humanity to humans. And I don't like to frame this history that way at all. And this isn't inhumanity. This is humanity. This is what people do to each other throughout human history. This is obviously a heightened example of it, but it's important for us to struggle with that inhumanity. And the film does that so well. There's so many things that you have to look at in this film that are so difficult to look at, but really important to look at.
Absolutely. And Sarah, question for you. Dr. Raphael Medoff, who was the founding director of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies in DC, said this about the series. I'd love to get your response. The documentary tends to minimize Franklin Roosevelt's responsibility for his own policy. Burns and his partners present a picture of America in which public opinion controls government policy, as if FDR was some sort of helpless prisoner of public anti-Semitism and racism.
Well, I think I sort of respectfully disagree. I hope we've done a good job of explaining how complicated our government was. And certainly Franklin Roosevelt is responsible for some of his government and his choices. And I would say this is not his finest moment, although I think he's one of the great presidents in American history. And I think contain both those feelings about FDR when it comes to this. I think we've reduced how the American government responded to some of these questions with our president. And I think we sometimes do that in American history and forget about the dynamics of how our Congress works, how our government works, how our citizenry works, how our electorate works. And, we did have a anti-Semitic State Department. We make that point over and over again in the film, and some of the more complicated villainous characters in the film are working in our State Department. Do I think Franklin Roosevelt could have done more and should have done more? Yes, and I think we can stand by that statement. So I hope the film shows all the complexity and nuance, and Danny is probably historically better equipped to think about specific moments in FDR in this history, but I hope we've done a good job of showing the full story of FDR and his response, good and bad.
I certainly think so.
Well, thank you.
Daniel, anything? Did you want to add anything to that?
I think there's been some oversimple explanations of Americans' response to the Holocaust that focus on questions that I often think move us away from complex thinking about history, like people asking, was FDR an anti-Semite, right? I think the key thing is to look at FDR's actions and inactions. And this film shows both actions and inactions. There are steps that FDR could have taken that he didn't. People will look at another very hot topic, the question about whether to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz in 1944, but they'll lift that out of history rather than try to think about it and understand it and struggle with it in a rich historical context. And once you do that, you realize For example, as this film states, that for America, for the United States, this war was never a war to rescue Jews. This was a war to defeat fascism. And those are two, in FDR's administration, those are two different things. So by the time that the War Department is asked by the War Refugee Board to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz, which they are in 1944, asked that, and they say no. One of their reasons is basically they say because that's not what the war is about. And for FDR's administration, that's true. And I can understand that there's moral outrage about that, and I can share some of the moral outrage about that. Deborah Lipstadt speaks very well about that in this film. But as a historian, we need to look carefully at the evidence, right? Not just at moral outrage about what didn't happen.
Absolutely. Okay. And I wanted to read another comment from Jonathan, who says, the dissolve of Golda Meir to Deborah Lipstadt was very cool, by the way. That's the only moment I smiled during the film.
Oh, yeah, it's a beautiful picture of Golda Meir.
Absolutely. Sarah, if you had another hour that you could produce on the film, is there anything that you would have liked to include?
We get asked that an awful lot. You know, I don't. There are some things that are on the cutting room floor that I personally think are great, or Ken thinks are great, or Lynn thinks are great, or Danny or Becky or Jeff. But I think we really are proud of the final product, and we are really interested and engaged in people's responses, both here, and we just came back from Berlin, where we had a very, very interesting conversation with film people in Germany and people in the government there. And we hope the film asks people to think about what's happening around us today, here and abroad, and how to be, as Danny said, a more active and engaged citizen, and push against the things that we think are wrong and push for the things that we think are right.
Absolutely. And we're incredibly grateful. And I know you both have very demanding schedules around the film and your other responsibilities at university and around the country making additional films. And we're really thrilled to have you. It's really a special privilege for us. And thank you so much.
We're glad to be here and happy we could do it.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm gonna ask our board member, Sam, Sam is, he's gonna just close us out for a minute or so. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I am, and before I thank you and talk a little bit more about organization, I'm just going to take a point of privilege since I have the mic. Sorry, Rachel. Given the news of this morning and what happened to Speaker Pelosi's husband, and very clear that the salient was coming after the speaker, which I think is probably comes from a similar motivation of some of the things we learned about in your film. I just want anybody who has the chance, Speaker Pelosi's father, when he was in Congress during this time and was extremely close to FDR, gave one of the most passionate speeches that any Zionist could ever want someone to give on the floor of the House, demanding action for the Jews. And then if the United States couldn't do something themselves, they needed to at least arm Jewish soldiers. So for anyone who wants to see a copy of that anytime, I can get it to the speech to Rachel, and we can distribute it through DMFI. But just thank you so much, Sarah and Daniel. Thank you so much for the work you did. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to join us for this briefing today. I've studied this my whole life, and I learned so much from watching the US and the Holocaust, and it was such a special honor to hear your personal insights and reflections about your involvement in the series. Just a little bit about Democratic Majority for Israel to our audience. For the past 3 years, DMFI has demonstrated that continuing to support the US-Israel alliance, which is rooted in shared values and America's national interest, is both good policy and wise political strategy. In just 3 years, DMFI has supercharged pro-Israel politics, bringing voice, strength, advocacy, and action to advance the US-Israel relationship. In states like mine, California, where anti-Israel amendments threaten to divide Democrats at party conventions, and in cities across the country where extreme activists proposed a number of anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic resolutions, DMFI rallied supporters, educated public officials, and engaged local leaders to successfully defend Israel's legitimacy. In early voting states, DMFI organized its supporters to ensure candidates heard from pro-Israel Democrats, whether at town halls, forums, or on social media. And we cannot be doing any of this work without your support. Your involvement with DMFI helps keep the Democratic Party pro-Israel and strengthens the US-Israel relationship. And for that, we are deeply grateful. Please sign up with us to stay in touch at dmfi.org and follow us on social media at I'm going to spell it out, at DMMAJ4, the number 4, Israel. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Sarah and Daniel, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Farewell, everybody.